We want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tonga and Creech Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamook, Serrano, Kawia, Peomkawichum, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, Kumyai, and the Quechan peoples whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the caretakers, the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the USC Van Hunnick History Department, we invite you to visit their website. For those of you watching on Zoom, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so feel free to let us know in the chat. And if you would like to know what Indigenous territory you're on, my colleague Maya will post a link where you can investigate that. My name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it is my pleasure to welcome those of you in person and those of you joining us online to today's Greenberg Fellow Lecture. I'm just pausing for a minute because of technical issues.
Someone's saying that we're still muted on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the audio from here.
Okay.
What we'll have to do before she plays her clips, though, is we'll have to do some things out there. Okay.
Okay. So the people on Zoom didn't hear any of that?
Some people say they could.
Because maybe the person has their volume down.
Some people are saying they can hear it. I'm suggesting for that person to connect audio on their Zoom.
Yeah.
It sounds like other people are hearing you.
Okay, maybe you could let us know in the chat if you're hearing us, so then we don't have to change all our audio settings. I would appreciate that. So as I was saying, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you. Thanks to those of you who came in person. We'd like your reviews of the food, please, because we're trying new establishments each lecture. Thanks to Maya for their work on that. And yeah, I'm just thrilled to welcome you to the Greenberg Fellow Lecture. So a couple of notes for the people on Zoom, assuming you can hear me. Right now you're viewing a side-by-side of the speaker and the slides, and I just mentioned that, so if you want to drag the dividing line between the two windows to make one bigger or smaller, please do so. Sometimes people like the speaker to be large and the slides to be small, or vice versa, so go for it. We will have time for questions and discussion following the lecture, so of course, as usual, we invite you in the room to participate, and on Zoom, you can participate in the discussion using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. We ask everybody to please be respectful in the chat and Q&A. And we will be sharing, we'll get to as many questions as we can, but we will be sharing all the questions and comments with our speaker following the lecture. So even if we don't get to your question online, she will see it later, or your comments. So now, to introduce today's speaker, it's my pleasure to welcome the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies, and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Gruner. Wolf?
Thank you very much, Martha, as always, also for preparing and organizing everything, and also Charlotte and Maya. Just to speak a little bit about, for those who don't know, the Center for Advanced Genocide Research We were founded in 2014, which might kind of ring a bell that this is our 10th anniversary, which is coming up very soon. So everything what we do is kind of leading towards a celebration after 10 lively and productive years. The center concentrates its efforts on developing innovative interdisciplinary research, focusing on 3 distinct areas, but not exclusively. Resistance to genocide and mass violence, violence, emotion, and behavioral change, and digital genocide studies. We organize a rich, as I already said, academic program which consists of annual international conferences, hosting numerous fellows like our speaker today, and also increasingly visiting scholars, as we have seen during the last events. This event was made possible by the Margee and Douglas Greenberg Research Fellowship. Those 2 were the first ones who endowed a fellowship to the center to enable an international PhD candidate to come to USC to do research at the center, mostly based on either the Visual History Archive of the USC Shore Foundation or other resources we have on Holocaust and genocide studies at USC. And we are very grateful for the kind of ongoing support of Margee and Douglas Greenberg. So coming to our speaker for today. So Alexandra Szabó is a PhD candidate at Brandeis University in history. And she's not totally new to us because she was a fellow, the inaugural fellow, and let me see the name, the inaugural Strauss Fellow at the Cedars-Sinai Center for Medicine, Holocaust and Genocide Studies last academic year. And in this capacity, she was already kind of visiting the center to work with the testimonies of the Shore Foundation. She earned her BA in American Studies and Pedagogy at, now I have a problem, Pázmány Péter Catholic University in Budapest. She holds 2 master degrees, one in literary and cultural studies from the Eötvös Loránd University, and another one in history from Central European University in Budapest, now in Vienna. Szabó co-founded and serves as a researcher for the interdisciplinary Digital Lens Research Group at the Eötvös Loránd University, which pursues digital research on Holocaust testimonies, focusing particularly on gendered experiences of the Holocaust, topographies of persecution, and language. Her dissertation is entitled A Prolonged Genocide, the Sterilization and Castration Experiences of the Hungarian Roma and Jews in National Socialist Camps. And as the title says, she focuses here on the experiences of Hungarian, Jewish, and Romani men and women and their experiences of sterilization and castration. She has already published numerous research articles, also book reviews and book chapters, and just to name a few, one is titled The Discovery of Unknown Holocaust Testimony. The D-Job Protocol of a Spouse was published just recently in December 23 in the issue of Eastern European Holocaust Studies. And to highlight this, she won an essay prize for cultural historians for this. Another article is The Changing Memories of Jewish Budapest, Pre- and Post-Holocaust Representations of a City. This article was published in 21 in Cultural History. And then the Corporal Continuation of the Holocaust, a look at miscarriages. This was published in the 2020 issue of the Hungarian Historical Review. She was also a recipient of the European Holocaust Research Initiative Crystal Fellowship in 2020-21 and earned various other fellowships and awards for her research from institutions like the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, the Tauber Institute, for the Study of European Jewry, the Hungarian American Coalition, and others. She also, and this is important to mention, she also served as an interviewer for the USC Shaw Foundation Last Chance Testimony Initiative. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. That was wow. I've never had such a long introduction. It feels great. Thank you. So hi everyone. Thank you for being here and thank you for your interest in my talk today. It's a real honor to be here to talk about my dissertation as a Margee and Douglas Greenberg Fellow. I'd like to thank the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Martha and Wolf, for your continuous support and your trust. And I'd also like to thank the Greenberg family for their generous support. So today I will be talking about a specific research phase of my dissertation that I'm pursuing as a PhD candidate with the supervision of Laura Jokusz. My dissertation at large studies the sterilization and castration experiences of Hungarian Jews and Roma in National Socialist camps, particularly in Auschwitz, in Birkenau, and in Lachenbach. This means that my contribution to the medical and social history of the Holocaust is the victim and a longue durée perspective, as I want to understand the fertility journeys and the personal stories after the survival of incarceration and the medical experiment that happened in the camp during the war years. Since my research so far yielded the understanding that the sterilization and castration experiments cause not only severe psychological effects, but constitutes of a continuous struggle, I call this specific atrocity and experience that the victims themselves were a prolonged genocide. Victim experiences show that the sterilization and castration experiments were indeed a means of genocide, as it extended the destructive effects on them from the immediate moment when the medical abuse happened, beyond the end of the war, and throughout their entire lifetimes. One very specific manifestation of this genocidal suffering is infertility and also secondary infertility. And there are also other results that the victims speak of. And as a Strauss Fellow last year at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, and also with the mentorship of Sabine Hildebrandt, MD from Harvard Medical University, I consulted the medical records of Holocaust survivors and learned that other life-debilitating physiological effects remained a source of suffering for the victims throughout their lives, such as cardiovascular diseases, psychological disorders, and other diverse syndromes that, for example, cause multiple organ failures. Prolonged genocide is present in the lives of victims also in less telling ways. And today I will focus on this, on one such manifestation, and that is the erasure or the attempted erasure from memory. Himmler's program of mass sterilization experiments in the camps was highly confidential, and his order of secrecy didn't only extend to his subordinates and to the collaborators who made the experiments possible, but it was also a guiding principle in the execution of the procedures, so that the victims themselves didn't know what was happening to them. The Nazis attempted to erase knowledge this way, and also the ability to remember the experiments, and most importantly, to voice them afterwards and their effects. This silencing can be detected in the archives and in the victim sources, among others in the video testimonies of the USC Shoah Foundation. During my research stay now at the center, I categorized the types of utterances and silences that I have found in the Visual History Archive that were indexed, and here are the indexing terms, together, and then I compared them together with additional findings that wouldn't actually be search results in the database, yet other sources point to them. So I put the categories on this slide, but I'd like to elaborate more in detail so the nuances of the types of silences can be laid out and can become clear. The main division according to which I could approach the findings first was whether the person describing sterilization or castration abuse was a witness or a victim. The majority of the findings were interviews with witnesses and not victims. Generally, this wouldn't necessarily point to any silence, as the witness testimonies do unveil knowledge of the procedures themselves, how they were conducted, and more importantly, they also talk about those victims who were killed right after the experiments took place. Most witness testimonies attest that the majority of the women, for instance, after having received intrauterine injections in Block 10 of Auschwitz, or most men after the surgical removal of their testes, were selected to be sent to gas chambers. Yet several witness utterances left me wondering whether the person sharing their story is actually about another person or is only a narrative comfortable in the third person singular. Holocaust researchers have already showed us that this is often the case with survivors of rape and other types of sexual abuse during the Holocaust, that the victims tell their stories as if it happened to their friend or comrade in the same barrack. In my research on sterilization and castration, which by the way is also another instance of sexual abuse as well, there is a marker that helps me understand that this person might not only be a witness but a victim themselves, and that's childlessness later in their lives. This is one of the main reasons that the USC Shoah Foundation's Video History Archives is one of the most important databases in my research. Survivors in the video testimonies generally talk about their families after survival, including their marriage or multiple marriages, their children, and their grandchildren. Looking at the indexed findings of videos where the survivors talk about witnessing sterilization or castration, this tendency changes, however. Several of the witnesses in my search do not mention children, nor have children or grandchildren indexed in their videos, and in most cases, the pre-interview questionnaires confirm that they actually do not have offsprings. This suggests that the witness category might not only include witnesses, but also victims who choose to silence their subjugation to sterilization or castration, but do not wish to silence the events themselves. The other main category in my research are those videos where the victims identify themselves as victims. These testimonies would also at first glimpse not suggest that there is any silence involved, since the memory of the experiment is articulated, and sometimes even the ongoing physiological or psychological suffering is told by the survivor. However, I do categorize two types of victim sources. One is verbal and the other is nonverbal. So here is, for example, Marta, who is very elaborate about her memories regarding sterilization experiment that she had endured, possibly by Dr. Klauberg. I'm going to play this clip now. She's speaking in Hungarian, but I put the caps there in English so everyone can understand.
Egyik szelektálásnál nem volt ott a teherautó. Mengele kiválasztott 3-4 fiatal nőt, 25-30 évesek voltak, én voltam a legfiatalabb. Egyik kápolnak mondott valamit, amit nem értettünk meg, és az elvitt bennünket a céllágerből. Kérdeztük a kápot, hogy hová visz bennünket, nem volt rá válasz. Rengeteg lágeren, voltak a lágerek, és különböző átjárók. Rengeteg lágeren és átjárókon keresztül messziről megláttam egy parasztházat. Parasztház, lágerbe, hát zöld fű a környékén, hát halvány gőzöm se volt, hogy ez mi ez hová visznek bennünket, és mi vár ránk, vagy a kápó egy szót se szólt. Végül bekerültünk a parasztházba, ahol voltak lepedők, két emeletes ágyas helyiségre emlékszem, hogy ezek ágyak kettősek voltak. Ehettem annyit, amit akartam, zappehelyre emlékszem, rengeteget ettem, és ihattam annyit, amennyit akartam. A bent lévők szintén 25-30 évesek lehettek, és nagyon sajnálkozva néztek rám. Észrevettem, hogy a épület egyik részében férfiak is vannak. Na, hol vagyok? Nem válaszoltak. Ez egy déli órákban volt. Semmit nem mondtak, csak állandó sajnálkozás volt, hová való vagy, anyád, apád, szóval ezek szövegek voltak. Több nemzetiség volt ott, de voltak ott magyarok is, és semmiről se tudtam semmit. Aztán másnap reggel megtudtam a megtudni valókat. Bevittek egy primitív orvosi szobának látszó helyiségbe, ahol volt egy nőgyógyászati asztal. Ott a hüvelyén keresztül maró folyadékot fecskendeztek belém, aminél erős fájdalmaim voltak, úgyhogy eszméletemet veszítettem. A petefészek tájékán mélyre, nem felületre, blokkádszerű injekciókat kaptam. Mind a két petefészek tájékán, és aztán visszavittek a szobába. A blokkád helyén ilyen különböző vörös foltok jelentek meg, arra emlékszem, és úgy emlékszem, hogy ezt még egyszer megismételték. De elmondottak szerint az igazi sterilizáció, mert ez az volt, ez 3 beavatkozást igényelt volna, de a második után egy pörsenést látott az orvos a mellemen. Mellesleg megjegyzem, az orvos kétsoros fekete, sötét ruhában volt, őszhaja volt, magas volt, jóképű, Mengele is ott volt, de Mengele irányította ezt az orvost. Instrukciókat adott neki, így megértettem. És ez az orvos végezte el az elvégezendő dolgokat. Tehát észrevették rajtam ezt a pörsenést, és egy kápót hívtak, és a kápó elvitt egy szelektáláshoz, akkor nem Mengele volt ott, hanem az a 100 orvos, aki a megérkezésünkkor ott volt, és a gázba küldött. Levittek meztelenül bennünket egy alaksori helyiségbe, betereltek egy eléggé kis helyiségbe, teljesen zsúfolva voltunk, engem az utolsók közé löktek be, és a szembelévő falra fölnéztem, és ott láttam egy 40 centi átmérőjű csövet, azon egy nagy korongot, és a korongon lukakat, 10 centi átmérőjű lukakat, amit szembe lehetett látni, és alul, hogy fölül és mögötte mi volt, azt nem tudom. Ránéztem, mondom, innen jön az égi áldás. Hogy jobbra voltak-e zuhanyozók, s balra voltak-e zuhanyozók, azt én nem láttam. Az emberek egy része, nagyon kevés része kezdett imádkozni, a többi része örjöngeni. Egymást és magukat harapták. Engem dermedt nyugalom szállt meg. Legyen vége ennek az őrületnek, minél előbb. A húgom is itt fejezte be, én is itt fogom befejezni. És úgy megfordultam, 180 fokos fordulattal, és láttam, hogy egy ilyen négyszögletes kémlelő ablak van bepárnázva, természetesen, és különböző SS női, férfi arcokat láttam vigyorogni, akik bekémleltek ezen az ablakon, nézni a zsidók örjöngését, szenvedését, kínozását, szag nem volt. Egyszer megjelent egy SS tiszt arca. Arra rájöttem a Mengele szelektálásánál, hogy nem szabad a szemébe nézni. Mert mit láthat a szememben? Vagy könyörgést, vagy félelmet, vagy erőltetett merevséget, tehát én igyekeztem mindig az arca mellett elnézni. Ennek a férfinek belenéztem a szemébe, mivel úgy sincs mit feszítenem. Már csak minél előbb legyen vége a dolognak. Erre kinyílt az ajtó, és megértettem az SS-tés üvöltését. Ti öten, rámutatott ötünkre, kifelé innen. Ti még tudtuk 2-3 hónapig dolgozni a birodalomnak. Ráértek azután megdögleni, mint a többiek.
So as we could hear from Marta herself, she was among those selected as not successful of the sterilization experiment. And she was sent to the gas chambers, but miraculously survived. While she's very outspoken in this video to what had happened to her in Auschwitz in 1944, she is less so about her infertility and the struggles of infertility after the war. She mentions her inability to become a mother very briefly at the end of the interview when she remembers what it was like for her to go back to Auschwitz in 1957. And then I stepped out the door, and there was grass growing, there were wildflowers, cows grazing, the sun was shining. There was no brick chimney, there was no smell of burnt bones. And then I had this feeling, this 180-degree turn, that I am here. I am here with the rest of me. Some of us are going to have children. I'm not, for various reasons, but they are. Now, the English translation might not provide entirely the same meaning as it does in the Hungarian, the way she's telling this section. But I can tell you that here she is in the moment of understanding that her people have survived, while her family and her sister hasn't. Although Marta, in different segments of the video, mentions the several physiological challenges, even surgeries, and her deteriorating physical and psychological state, this moment of her stepping back into her past in the same space, and then back into her present, now without the ability to become a mother, in an ambivalent, complex way, she is celebrating other Jewish mothers who will become mothers. Collectively, she hasn't become a victim of genocide, only individually. Marta's video testimony is quite unique, since the majority of the victims that I could identify as victims of sterilization or castration express their memories and experiences non-verbally. And this is the next category. Fanny, for example, portrays her memory and pain without words. And here I'd like to warn everyone that I will be showing an extremely difficult clip. So I understand if someone needs to leave the room or needs to turn their Zoom off. I was hesitating whether I should show her video at all, because I have talked about Fanny at different conferences before, but I never showed clips. I only gave a narrative or interpretation of her testimony. But here at USC, I'm at the very source of the database where I have found Fanny. And since she agreed to give her testimony when the interview was recorded in the 1990s, I won't take her voice away.
Did you ever receive any medical treatment while you were in Auschwitz?
They fooled us. They said that they're gonna take us to learn to be a noise, but they fooled us. You know, they took us there to sterilize. You should never have children. So
Did that happen to you? You said, Fanny, that at some point you got these white scarves.
So the interviewer here directs her attention away from her mental distress of reliving the past with an entirely different question. Fanny had the courage to sit in front of the camera and give an interview that lasts approximately 1.5 hours and ends after her inability to speak about her infertility later in life that follows not soon after this excerpt. During her growing mental distress, she repeats a couple of times that she cannot talk, adds that she had been operated on and thus is unable to express herself anymore, and is unable to cry, although she is crying. The interviewer, respecting Fanny's struggles and pain, thanks her, and the interview comes to an end. The entire video testimony is incredibly difficult to watch, up to the point that it raises the ethical questions whether it is worth asking survivors to recount their experiences and what the limitations could and should be. And while I still struggle with these questions, I see Fanny's testimony as the ultimate explanation to why we have such a low number of accounts from the women and men who couldn't become parents after the Holocaust. Fanny's account carries the significance of what the middle ground is between voices and silences. Her testimony informs the framework according to which I analyze verbal, nonverbal, and silent testimonies in their complexities. The third category of the testimonies are the negative or silent testimonies. I call them negative because the testimony of witnessing and surviving the Holocaust exists, but sterilization or castration experimentation is not mentioned. And here, I can only include those people whom I know had the knowledge about having been experimented on from other sources. Such an example is Henrietta Sepes's case. Here is a short clip from her testimony about a selection that will be important so we can all understand what her silence is.
És aztán 3 hét múlva, amikor ott voltunk egyszer megint célappel, és megint jött a Mengele. Megint feltett karokkal kellett megjelenni pucéron előtte, és megint elkezdte ezt a mutogatást. Én egy rettenetes sovány lány voltam. Annyira sovány voltam, hogy egyszer az iskolaigazgató még a zsidó elemében megkérdezte az unokatestvéremet, mond, ez a Henny kap otthon enni? Mert hát ez valami rémes, hát hogy ne kapna. Na most én nagyon sovány voltam, és láttam, hogy akiket arra az oldalra irányított a Mengele, hogy azok úgy jobb kondícióban voltak, mint én.
Újra le kellett vetkőzni, vagy ez?
Persze, újra levetkőzni, újra pucéron, és akkor megint kezdett, hogy ki ide megy, ki oda megy, és láttam, hogy érdekes, hogy ott vannak a túloldalon olyanok, akik sokkal jobb kondícióban voltak, mint én. Egyszerre jött, azt hiszem Krakó volt, egész közel Auschwitzhoz, az első rettenetes légitámadás. Hát a németek olyan pánikba estek, hogy hasra feküdtek meg, sehova nem figyeltek, és ez alatt az idő alatt én nem tudom, hogy mert nem tudatosan, hanem ösztönszerűleg, hasonkúszva átmentem ahhoz a csoporthoz, akiket úgy jobb kondícióban láttam magamnál.
So I found another testimony of hers, an official letter written to the General Banking and Trust headquarters in Budapest, which was the official body in socialist Hungary that transferred compensation to the victims of Nazi medical experiments within the framework of the Federal Republic of Germany's Compensation Act of 1953 and the Reimbursement Act of 1957. In this letter, this is handwritten by her, Henrietta testifies that she had undergone gynecological experiments of which she couldn't see much, as her face was veiled off with a towel-like object. She felt the perpetrators touching her down there, and then a sensation in her genitalia that turned into painful irritation. After the veiled intervention, they took her back to the barrack, and she started experiencing abdominal pain that lasted for hours. This whole procedure was repeated about 10 days later. After the second painful instance, where she was possibly subjected to Nazi gynecologist Karl Klauberg's sterilization injections, she became extremely weak. This is when the next selection happened that she's talking about in the video. And she writes in the letter, she didn't find herself among the strong-bodied women, but because of an explosion and chaos, she could go over to the other side and was eventually transported further to Hesse-Lichtenau for forced labor. The reasons why some survivors choose to remain silent in their VHA testimonies are several, into which I don't have time to go into now, but of course I'll carefully analyze that in my dissertation, and we can also talk about that in the Q&A section. Some historians believe that the witness testimonies aren't trustworthy, but I wish to disagree. In Henrietta's case, for example, I could follow up with her family, who knew about the injections. They had known it all their lives. And they also know about Henrietta's post-war menstruation and fertility problems. But they didn't know, and possibly Henrietta didn't know, what exactly the injections were or why they did this to her. And finally, I categorize the testimonies I have found, or actually not found, in the VHA as to what I call the silenced testimonies. So these are the silent and the silenced testimonies, which are actually non-existent testimonies. I know it's strange to mention testimonies that do not exist when giving a talk about findings of what is there, But I find it very important to highlight the non-existent voices as well, as they are archival silences. And I want to emphasize that I'm not blaming anyone for the lack of these testimonies. USC Shoah Foundation's achievement of having recorded over 50,000 video testimonies is extraordinary and exemplary. It is exactly this huge achievement that requires us historians and researchers to look behind it, because having such a rich resource might suggest to future students and future generations that everything is there. But not everything is there in the archive. Not every story has been told. For my research specifically, those Jewish and Romani men, and only men, who underwent sterilization or castration surgeries are the most hidden. According to witness testimonies, testimonies, including Richard Feiner, who you can see on this slide, and this is right after he was liberated. He was one of the nurses in Block 21, where he remembers that several of these, quote, beautiful boys, strong men, disappeared after their surgeries. But not all. Those who were not selected to be murdered after the medical abuses remained silent and hidden, their experience possibly embedded in deep shame and humiliation that hasn't allowed them to speak. This is an excerpt from the Nuremberg Military Tribunal's trial against Nazi physicians, an example from the witness stand regarding men's sterilization and castration that is the most detailed from my research so far about what had happened. A man who shall remain anonymous, as it was his own request back in 1946, had undergone extreme radiation for castration purposes and then an orchiectomy, which is the surgical removal of a testicle. And then I'll read it because I'm not sure how well you can see. Witness, I will ask you a few questions now, which I will want you to answer. Please, go ahead. This first time that you were sterilized was in October 1943? August, September, that is right. And what was done by means of X-ray machine? That was done by rays. I do not know what kind of rays. I'm not a doctor. I only say what I know. A Luftwaffe officer, a tall man, did that. That is what I saw. I don't know what kind of rays they were. Did they protect your thighs with any sort of lead sheeting or other material? Yes, plates. 2 plates were put between the legs. In spite of this protecting material, did you receive burns on your thighs? Yes, I'm still burned today. You can see it today. And then, as I understand your testimony, approximately 2 weeks later, you had your testicles removed? Yes. Do you know why that was done? No. Because I am a Jew, I know that much. Do you know any of the doctors or other people in the camp who did these things to you? No. But I asked at Auschwitz, who does these things? I heard a name, the name of Dr. Schumann, and I remembered that name, and I remember it until today, but I do not know that person myself. How many other boys were subjected to these rays with you the first time? Operated on with me were 20 people, but transports were arriving all the time, every few days, every few weeks. Many transports arrived. Did they tattoo a number on your forearm while you were in the camp? Yes, I have a number, and then that's omitted. Will you show that to the tribunal, please? Yes. Do you know whether or not any of the other boys were sterilized with you died as a result of the sterilization? From the sterilization, no. But later, many were gassed. Very few are still alive. Did you have pictures made of you when you were here in Nuremberg several weeks ago? When? In Nuremberg? Yes. And then after this, the prosecution team shows a photo of his blackened thighs and genitals to the tribunal. These are very tangible and specific pieces of evidence that would have allowed the victim 10, 20 years later to apply for compensation. Yet not everyone did. Even though there's a huge body of claims documentation that I am consulting for my dissertation on Hungarian men and women, from these witnesses, I know that it is only a fraction of the victims. One underlying reason why the majority of the men didn't apply for compensation claims that I see in the case of Hungarian Romani peoples, for example, is the problem of access. The majority of the Romani men and also women who had been subjected to the mass sterilization experiments in camps and returned to Hungary were illiterate. There are some examples where the neighbors or friends helped them in filling out the necessary documents, but this must not have been the general case. There's a huge gap when it comes to studying the medical experiments that Romani peoples underwent in Nazi camps, which became evident to me from all the sources available about the Lovara people, Hungarian traveling Romanikin who lived in the Burgenland area before the war. Those Lovara families who had been deported in the 1940s testified and exhibited tremendous effort not to be silenced after the war and fought against the anti-Roma sentiments still prevalent in Europe. This is what the Lovara written testimonies look like that I found in Vienna. But some Lovara individuals also created art to express their pains and suffering, and some gave video testimonies. And so far, I've only found the Lovara Romani peoples in Hungary, who are called Romungro. I haven't found any written materials yet and probably won't. So Chaya Stoika, for instance, has seen some girls undergo sterilization experimentation in Ravensbrück, which she tells in a video testimony of the VHA. I didn't manage to translate this clip, so I'm afraid only German speakers will understand. I'm sorry, although it's a difficult Austrian dialect. But Chaya's interview in the VHA has been transcribed. Interestingly, I'm afraid this specific segment, which is a minute, about sterilization is not there. Another section's translation is running under the clip.
Ja, mit verspritztem Blut, wenn die Frauen sterilisiert worden sind. Und das Blut ist ihnen beim Mund und Nase und überall rausgekommen. Und da war ein Mädchen, die hat keine Freunde, also niemand gehabt. Resi hat sie geheißen. Und weil sie allein war, habe Mama gesagt, Mama, nimm's zu uns. Die hat gar niemanden. Und die hat mit mir geschlafen, mit der Kathi, mit meiner Mama. Bis sie es weggeführt haben zum Sterilisieren. Dann haben sie es zurückgebracht wie ein verbranntes Schweinderl. Ein paar haben auf dem Bretterwagen noch zappelt. Aber nicht mehr lang. Dann waren sie alle tot. Das Blut ist runtergerunnen von den Wagen in den frischen Schnee.
Chaya's testimony, similarly to the written forms of Lovara accounts, is filled with the present tense narrative format of clear dialogues even. And while in her interview she is kept between questions, her unique way of remembering how she, her mother, and sister tried to help a girl who had undergone sterilization experiments of intrauterine injections, by swallowing her tears, she allows her memories to come to surface as if it was an inner monologue, but suddenly leaves the topic behind. So it's a tiny bit chaotic, but still understandable. I'm glad that she was recorded by the Shoah Foundation in 1998. It is only her from her nuclear family who was interviewed, and 3 other Stoikas, Karl, Johann, and Katarina, from the extended family. I'm including the Stoika and the Horvat families who are intermarried with the Stoikas, the Horvat, in my research as Lovara women and men who had undergone mass sterilization experiments in the Lachenbach camp on the border of Austria and Hungary. And to conclude my talk, I will now show the unconventional means of testimony. Chaya has come to be known as an artist, and through her art, she communicates her family's past, joys, and sufferings. This painting is titled Die Mama and shows a glimpse of her life before deportation. To my biggest excitement, her paintings are exhibited at the Wende Museum here in LA now. I encourage everyone to go and visit the exhibition. Her important work is all there, I believe, before it closes on Sunday. So I'd like to thank everyone for the attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for such an illuminating, you can stay there, thanks for such an illuminating lecture.
Thank you.
And I'll let you call on people here in the room, and then just a reminder to please keep your voices up, because there's a microphone in the sky that allows people online to hear you. And for those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom. And Maya will read your questions in the room, as many as we can get to. Maya, do you want to say something?
Yeah, so we've already got a question from the Zoom from Adriana Reynoso, who's a Holocaust indexer at the Shoah Foundation. Thank you for your presentation and your important work, Alexandra. Are there any other terms in addition to the existing index of terms that you think we should add that would help identify other testimonies that might include information or silences on castration?
Definitely, I can work on that. Yes, I can't answer right here, right now. I would have to go through my list, but yes, and if she or other indexers are open to it, I can even add indexes to the videos that don't have indexes but are talking about sterilization. Yes.
Thank you so much for this. I have two questions. So one, I was wondering, did you find that there was a difference in, the voices versus silences between those who were speaking in Hungarian versus those who were giving their testimony in a different language? Or more broadly, like those who were situated in Hungary at the time of their interview, those who were not. And then my other question was, I was really drawn to, the notion of the family and the post-war and talking about children, and I was wondering if any of the testimonies, or if you found in your research those who form, quote-unquote non-traditional via like adoption, or like those who are not biologically, and like if they were able, if you found any testimonies where they have children through non-biological means and how they process that versus their sterilization or castration.
Yes, thank you. I'll start with the second question. So the pre-interview questionnaire for the Shoah Foundation uses the word biological children, so that's a big help for me. And there are instances where I see one child, but they don't talk about, so the child is either in the PIQ or is indexed in the video, but the interviewee doesn't really talk about the child. Those cases leave me wondering, and yes, I have thought about adoption. I don't think it was that common in the 50s and 60s as it is now, but is absolutely could be another marker for me to see. And but I haven't come across any video testimony yet where the survivor details how they adopted a child. As for Hungarian English or other languages, that's a great question. Especially the English-speaking interviews, I do sense the language as a barrier in expressing themselves, and not well, especially for example, with Fanny, especially with these difficult and intimate questions, but also in other sections of the interview, you could sense that they're having language problems. But for example, I showed you Richard Feiner, who was a male nurse in Block 21, and when he talks about castration, he says, well, they took his eggs out. And it takes him quite a while to use the word eggs, which is clearly, his way of expressing it, and everybody understands. And I replayed that several times to see if this is him being uncomfortable with the language or the memory. But he also gazes so much out, not at the interviewer, not at the camera, but out, that I don't think it's the language there. I think it's his way of, it's difficult to express what exactly happened when there was an orchiectomy involved.
So I know your concept of prolonged genocide complicates the binary that people think about when it comes to the Holocaust and genocide. And I'm wondering how this also informs the terms that you're using in your talk or in your research. I noticed pretty early on you were using the word victim a lot instead of survivor, but then you would sometimes slide into calling them survivors.
Yes.
So I'd just like to hear more about your reflections on those terms.
Yes. This is something I also had at my talk last year, where I say they didn't survive, but then I call them survivors. Yes, it's something I have to be more conscious of. The whole concept of prolonged genocide I'm still working on. I definitely want to, I'm not saying we have to change our vocabulary, but I definitely want to blur the lines of survival, of genocide, and not making them as finite as we think of them in regards to the Holocaust. And actually, I think this is something that also Dan Stone's new book is talking about, that the Holocaust isn't over in some sense. And for these people, the Holocaust was over, but it really wasn't for their lifetime. So, and some people actually in the videos don't call themselves survivors. Like Marta here, she's giving the understanding that she considers herself a survivor, but I looked at the video and she's not saying the word survival. So it's complex, and this is the reality, and I just want to show with my term of prolonged genocide, without really wanting to change any vocabulary, just to complicate the understanding that it's not black and white.
Thank you so much for such an incredible talk. So in your work, you've been using the words sterilization and castrations in reference to women and men. So I was wondering if you could speak more about these distinctions and their significance to your
Yes, thank you for that question. It's very important. I had thought that castration only happens to men and sterilization to women, but that's incorrect. So both procedures can happen to both sexes. Castration is where the hormone producing gland is destroyed, and sterilization is where the ducts are destroyed, or the entire uterus for the women. So it's the organ itself, or where the hormone is being produced within the organ. And this is actually not only for us to understand better what these procedures were, but interestingly, so my final chapter in my dissertation will be a close reading of the Nuremberg military trial against Nazi physicians, the doctor's trial, because there I have a strong feeling that the defense team for the physicians was using this distinction. And for example, for Caladium seguinum, which is a plant, an herbal plant, that they used in Lachenbach and maybe in other camps, that is debunked by the tribunal, that it wasn't used, it wasn't effective, sterilization didn't happen with it. And then I looked deeper into what exactly this plant is and what exactly they did with it, and there's pretty big proof that it was produced by the masses and taken to Lachenbach and other camps, and it was a castrating drugs. So when the physicians were asked, did you sterilize people with this, and they say no, they weren't lying, they were castrating. And so, but even here in this example, you could see that the man on the stand, the anonymous man on the stand, says he was sterilized, where he was actually castrated by means of X-ray and surgery. So it seems unimportant, but it actually changes the entire story, knowing the difference between the two. Yes.
Thank you so much. I want to stick with kind of interrogating terms. So when you made a slight remark saying sterilization and castration is sexual abuse, and I want you to elaborate a little bit more about this, because in the recent past we are really extending the kind of the use of kind of sexual abuse. We had a talk of a fellow kind of claiming that invasive body searches are also kind of sexual abuse. So can you elaborate a little bit more on this?
Yes. So there was a book published in 2010 by Rochelle Seidel and Sonia Hedgepath on sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust. And in this book, there is a chapter, well, there's an entire section where this expansion is happening. And then there's an author who includes sterilization, abuse, but the entire, so from 1933 in Germany, and then this section where it extends from Germany into concentration camps and other sites. Unfortunately, I haven't seen conceptual work of this after this publication. I know it is considered as one, and the body searches are definitely something that I see more or I read more and more research on. As for the abuse of reproductive organs and fertility, there are works out there, but they don't go into the conceptual understand, or they don't give the framework of this yet. So I plan to do it in my dissertation, but I don't want to overdo it either, and I find it important to categorize it as precisely as I can, because, for instance, the castration and sterilization abuse that happens to men in the camps is not the same as what happens to gay men in Germany. There, it's more of a targeted sexual abuse as it is here. So there are fine lines that I still need to think about. Yes.
So in the Shoah Foundation Oral History Archive, a big family and children are given the symbolic meaning of resilience and hope for the future. So I wonder if you can talk about the message part of all these interviews that we went through. So did they produce new meanings that enable this body of testimonies to fit in the Shoah Foundation? Did the interviewers try to push the interviewee to go in this direction?
Yes, good question. In the final sections of the interview about the future message, I think generally what I found, and now I've looked over 70 or 80 videos now, and I know those videos as well where the person has not been sterilized or castrated. Here I sense less of an optimism. It's so interesting to see, especially the women from Block 10, they start talking about contemporary politics so much, and how they're afraid, but they don't have families. So it's interesting how they're afraid for the world, but so it's always a sense of collective that I see with them. But as for future message, I think I just sense that they are more pessimistic.
I was wondering, because you've mentioned that some historians did not find the testimonies credible, and I was just wondering why.
Well, we have two big Holocaust historians in the room, so maybe they can answer this better than I can arriving to the field. I don't understand it either. I mean, there's a whole this has its own history and development history, going back to all the way to the German historians debate and further, and then we have integrated history from Friedlander. So there's a whole background to this, which is decades of work. And actually, Laura Jokusch, my advisor, she's one of her work debunks this myth that also Jews didn't talk. They did talk, but nobody wanted to listen. So it has its own pathway. As to why there are historians still today who don't believe him, I don't know. Yeah.
Should I?
Yes, please.
I think one of the main reasons is that the argument was that the memory is not reliable, that they kind of confuse facts, that they confuse dates. Today we know that this is not the most important because the experience is truthful. So I think there is a generational shift. There's a kind of a shift over the decades in the use of testimonies, and today it's kind of standard for everybody doing Holocaust studies using testimonies. So that's
Yeah. And there was also, I love this debate between Broschat and Friedlander, where he says, so the German historian says that these are subjective sources, so they can't be trusted as much, while the official documentation in the German archives are objective. And then Friedlander says, like, how those are produced by Nazis. How is that objective? It's also the other side producing the document. So it's been a fight for decades.
So I have a couple questions from Zoom. So I might just I'll ask them one at a time though. So from Will Jones, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. Your observation about the lack of children in the lives of witnesses, like meaning that they may themselves be victims, is really incredible and discerning. Does this apply across both men and women?
Yes, absolutely. But as I marked in my talk, so far, I haven't. These are the video testimonies that I'm looking at now. There are other testimonies, a lot of other written testimonies, memoirs, and several other sources. So far, I see that it's actually more prevalent among men who don't tell their stories, or don't tell them as first person singular, at least.
Thank you. And from Catherine Funk, who's a master's student in Holocaust studies, are you familiar with the work that is being done about chemicals being put in food in concentration labor camps to forcibly sterilize women in the camp? Is this something that you've been looking at in your research? Are you focusing more on medical experimentation? Many survivors described the rumors that there were chemicals put in the food, but so far only Peggy Pine-Potts that I know of has been studying that.
Yes, I know her study, and yes, I don't know. I'm a little conflicted about the study. I do have the same findings that those people who clearly talk about sterilization and castration mention food additives or whatever. They say it was brome that was added to their coffee. And I know Karl Klauberg's research, and there might have been something put into the coffee. Now, But I talked to physicians at Cedars-Sinai, and there they told me that it's the body's reaction not to menstruate in such an environment. So it could be, I don't know. And I was thinking about it, whether I should include this in my dissertation, and I probably won't, because I don't want to go down that rabbit hole where I want to understand what was put in the injections, I can't find the substance today, and even if I did, I have no idea how to understand what it is. I mean, I could go back to Cedars-Sinai in a lab and ask them, but this is, I'm more focused on the victims than what exactly the medicine was, or I don't even know how to call it, the medical ways were.
Absolutely. And then I have one more question, and then I'll pass it back to folks. And Kevin actually just said, thank you very much for the thoughtful response. That is very interesting insights. And I'll just say that there were two museum educators at the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle, Marcy Bloom and Carl Shutoff, who were just very interested in the words, and you've already talked about it a little bit after Mark asked about it, about the term like prolonged genocide.
Mm-hmm.
I think Carl asked, could the notion of prolonged genocide be applied to those who survived horrific experiences but who do not undergo medical experimentation? But they were just interested in that term.
If it applies to those who hadn't been sterilized or castrated?
Yes.
Well, that has to be someone else's work. I'm applying it to those who had been sterilized or castrated, but I would love it if it could be a bigger term than that. Yes.
Well, those were my questions from the Zoom, so I'm going to pass it back to the audience here.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit about the Nazis' intentions in doing this kind of experimentation on people that they were going to exterminate?
Yeah, so that's why also I'm lucky to have the Hungarian language, because mine is a case study on Hungarian, Roma, and Jews, and the majority en masse had been deported to Auschwitz in 1944, by which time the war effort of the Germans had changed. At this point, they understood that they need as much of forced labor as they can get in order to, well, I don't know if they thought that they would win, but in order to reproduce arms, for example. And the Hungarians, so I always want to decentralize Auschwitz in Holocaust studies, but for Hungarians it's important because that's where they first arrive, to Birkenau. And then they're taken further, and there's this huge, and this is actually something that we did with the digital lens research group, that we're showing it on maps, how they arrived to Birkenau from Hungary. But then there's this huge net that they go out to sites and locations for forced labor that are not even in our vocabulary. So the experience for the victims is actually not Auschwitz. It is for those who then are selected to be gassed. And they take women, a lot of women, to these forced labor sites, which are, again, either camps or sites of factories or whatnot. And the women are sterilized before that. And this injection, this Klauberg method of injection, which literature writes it happened in Block 10, which is the main location of it, but it did go out from Block 10. So there were several other places, for example, the Lagererweiterung, which were like wooden blocks after Auschwitz. So they built as many places as they can, and they took the injections with them, possibly so that they don't have to immediately murder. They inject them, they use them for forced slave labor, and then they won't have the ability to reproduce further generations.
Any other questions? Well, please join me in thanking Alexandra. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And as I mentioned last week, we have many events in the next few weeks. Our next event is on Monday. It is the most distinguished lecture that the center organizes every year, the Shapiro Scholar Lecture, which we organize with the USC Shoah Foundation. This year's recipient of the Shapiro Fellowship is Dan Stone, and he will be lecturing on his recent book, The Holocaust, An Unfinished History. And for those of you in the room and those of you in LA who are watching on Zoom, the USC Shoah Foundation is hosting a lunch following the lecture at the University Club. So space is limited. Please RSVP, and we hope to see you there. Thank you so much, everybody.